The synthetic light of the display washed out the tired lines on Elias Thorne's face, leaving him looking less like a commander and more like a statue carved from exhaustion. 60 standard hours without true sleep. His hands, resting on the gravimetric control slab, were steady, almost unnaturally so, yet the scent of burnt dust and old ozone that clung to the small cabin of the Cassandra made his mouth taste perpetually metallic, the flavor of stale air and sheer, raw adrenaline. He was keenly aware of the void, not as a concept, but as the absolute, indifferent cold seeping through the deck plates, a constant, personal reminder of how little effort it would take for physics to erase them all. "The Cathar Vanguard is holding position, Commander," Viridian reported, the AI's voice a modulated calm that always infuriated Elias. It possessed the cadence of a superior observer. "Their formation is textbook standard. Armored frigates on the flanks, sensor vessels arrayed centrally. They are waiting for the full jump-in sequence." Textbook standard. Yes, Elias murmured, his eyes straining against the light. He knew that textbook meant arrogance. It meant they hadn't programmed for theoretical gravitational weaponry. They hadn't accounted for the fact that a desperate civilization would anchor a micro-singularity, the captured eye of the void, at the edge of the Kuiper Gap, and use it as a cosmic slingshot. He pressed the console's surface. The controls were cool and smooth, but Elias felt the faint, high-frequency tremor running up through the deck from the ship's primary engines beginning their final, destabilizing push. Outside the main viewport, the stars were beginning to stretch, elongated impossibility curving around the massive, dark distortion of the eye. It was reality being pulled taut, ready to snap. The trajectory margin remains 0.003%. Viridian continued, a clinically delivered death threat. A single error in the projection angle will result in a resonance cascade affecting our own stabilizing fields. We will be crushed into a sheet of plasma before the enemy even registers the anomaly. Elias didn't need the warning. He knew the numbers better than he knew the faces of his own crew. This wasn't about heroism. It was about geometry and survival, driven by a primal, desperate need. Conventional defense had failed 3 days prior. What remained was this desperate physics gamble. He thought of the dust, not the burnt dust of the cabin, but the fine gray powder on the bridge of the transport Stygius III. He hadn't been on the bridge, but in engineering, monitoring the structural integrity readings. He saw the numbers tick down, 300 lives reduced to a failing integrity score of 0.04% before the Cathar had even registered them as hostile. His calculations that day had been perfect for defense. They failed the reality test. Jorik had been on that transport the last time Elias saw a friendly face unprotected by armor or calculation. The dust of that failure still felt layered beneath his skin. He placed his hands on the projection levers. The trembling started, not from fear of the Cathar, but from the memory of the 300 lives he couldn't save with mere defensive physics. This time, he wouldn't fail due to insufficient violence. This time, the mathematics were absolute. "Projection pulse initiated," he announced, the words tight in his throat, tasting like a coin in his mouth. The shift was instantaneous and sickening. There was no bright flash of energy. Instead, a deep, pervasive compression squeezed the Cassandra. Elias gasped, his stomach simultaneously lifting and dropping, a nausea born of immense, unnatural forces he himself was commanding. He squeezed his eyes shut, his focus entirely on the feedback tremors running up through the controls, listening to the high, whining shriek of the gravitic resonator building and shunting energy into the distortion field, forcing the gravitational wave pulse to travel around the curved space-time of the eye. The sensation was not pain, but a violation of everything solid. Target 1, the central sensor vessel, Elias ordered. His breath was held, the cold sweat on his forehead already chilling. Viridian delayed for a silence that stretched for 2 years in Elias's mind. Then the report. Primary sensor signatures of Target 1 have flatlined. Communications array dark. Life support readings show immediate systemic failure. Tidal stress calculated at 6.4 million Gs upon impact. Shielding failed instantly. Target 1 is now inert debris. Elias let out the breath, a long, shaky exhale that rattled in his chest. 6 million Gs. It wasn't kinetic force. It was the universe deciding that the Cathar vessel was simply wrong, twisting its geometry until it was nothing. The memory of the Stygius 3 faded, replaced by the grim satisfaction of a flawless, brutal calculation. Target 2, the forward armored cruiser. Elias continued, his voice gaining that terrible chilling efficiency. The metallic taste of fear was gone, replaced by an unnerving focus. He felt the cold pressure of the joystick against his palms. His competence was terrifying, even to himself. On the main display, the second massive ship vanished from the sensor logs. Not a flicker, just a dark, sudden, terrifying silence. They didn't adapt, Elias noted, the grim humor brittle. They didn't program for absolute geometry, too primitive to assume we would use the fabric of space-time against them. Their response time suggests systemic paralysis, Commander, Viridian countered. They are freezing. Target 3 is now static and unaware of the incoming wavefront. The primary fleet is maintaining formation, awaiting orders that will not arrive. The methodical destruction continued. Vessel 3 flatlined. Vessel 4 followed. The sensor map showed the vast, imposing ships still physically present, angular teeth of metal drifting slightly off course, but the digital representation of their life, their weapon status, their engine glow, all flatlined. They were ghosts of metal, dead before they knew they were attacked. They didn't even have time for fear. Elias watched the fourth ship blink out of active existence. He realized his hands were shaking violently, a deep internal tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the crushing adrenaline descent after such precision. He had just condemned tens of thousands of lives to gravitational crushing, silent and absolute. He felt no triumph, only a profound, professional exhaustion and a strange emptiness, as if the immense wave of energy he had fired had hollowed him out too. 5 and 6 remain, he stated, his voice flat, demanding he finish the job. He couldn't stop now. Not after Yorick, not after the dust. The remaining fleet is still moving towards the jump point, Commander, Viridian pointed out, but the destruction of the Vanguard has induced a critical system failure across their command structure. The primary fleet is scattering, assuming an internal catastrophe. They do not comprehend the nature of the attack. Elias stretched his neck. It felt like hardened wire, unable to bear the weight of his helmet if he wore one. He looked at the vast, alien silence on the screen. The physics held. The theory worked. He had saved, perhaps, billions of lives from invasion. And yet, the silence of the Cathar sensors was a monumental, unbearable sound. The sound of finality, of certainty, and of utter, lonely, destructive power wielded without emotion. He ran the final 2 calculations, pulling the resonance wave around the curvature of the eye one last time. It required a movement of the control slab so delicate it was barely perceptible, a flicker of muscle memory that only years of working with volatile compression fields could provide. The movement was practiced, flawless, divorced from the exhausted man sitting in the command seat. Targets 5 and 6 neutralized, Viridian confirmed, the AI's voice as dry and devoid of emotional inflection as the physics itself. The invading force has scattered and is retreating from the system. Mission parameters exceeded. Civilization secured at the cost of 73% power depletion and the permanent destabilization of local space-time. Elias leaned back fully, allowing the backrest to take his weight. The Cassandra drifted away from the black hole. The stars slowly, almost reverently, shimmered back into their proper, ordered places. The scent of ozone had faded. All he could hear was the faint, rhythmic pulse of the life support system. He had survived. Humanity had survived. He thought about the Cathar commander, utterly bewildered in his high-tech bridge, watching his sensor array fail and then feeling the universe fold in on him. It wasn't courage that won. It wasn't skill. It was knowing the darkest tricks of the cosmos. "Well, Viridian," Elias finally whispered, his voice catching. "It seems we won. What's the next maintenance schedule look like?" "Extensive and expensive, Commander. The gravitic resonator is fractured, and the space-time anomaly generated by the forced slingshot will require localized field dampeners for approximately 6 solar cycles to prevent micro-rift bleed," the AI replied, detailing the steep price of victory. Elias stared at the dead, dark void where the enemy had been. He hadn't just defeated an army, he had insulted reality itself and destabilized the very foundation of their solar system's geometry. He reached out a shaking hand and touched the smooth control slab. He felt the cold. This precision, this willingness to manipulate absolute, terrifying power. It wasn't the training of a mere fleet engineer. It was the detached capability of someone who had seen what happens when you hesitate, when you rely on conventional warfare. Elias Thorne was the only one who had ever mastered the controlled slingshot. The military had never fully trusted him, viewing him as dangerously obsessive. But here, with the lives of billions depending on 0.003% precision, his dark, specialized expertise was the only thing that mattered. He was a weapon, and he was tired of being clean. He was tired of being good. He looked at the sensor logs one last time. The total absence of Cathar signatures was confirmed. The victory was complete. Yet, the price of space-time destabilization, the sheer astronomical mess he had created, hung over him. He knew the calculations required to stabilize the system would be exponentially harder than the calculations required to destroy the fleet. He hadn't just won. He had secured a temporary, fragile peace by fundamentally breaking the space around them. And the look in his eyes now was not that of a relieved commander. It was the cold, calculating focus of a man who suddenly realized that the specialized physics he had used to save humanity were the exact physics that would inevitably doom it, if used by the wrong hands. The terror wasn't the enemy outside. The terror was realizing that the only man who knew how to use this weapon was Elias himself, and he had only just scratched the surface of what the controlled eye of the void could do. And somewhere, perhaps far beyond the scattered Cathar fleet, someone was surely watching the impossible sensor readings, the sign of a new, dangerous variable in the universe. Someone would adapt, and when they did, Elias would have to be ready to calculate something even colder, even darker. He didn't want to be this person, but the ghost of Jorik told him he had no other choice. He had exchanged one kind of void for an infinitely more complicated one. He gripped the control slab, feeling the absolute cold, and waited for the inevitable response. The silence that followed the retreat of the Cathar was not peace, but the heavy, ringing hum of stress. It vibrated through the metal lattice of the Cassandra, a low-frequency growl that Elias felt in his teeth, not his ears. The deck plates, recently freezing, were now warm to the touch, radiating the stored thermal residue of 73% power depletion. He had saved the system, but the ship itself felt fundamentally traumatized, like a pressurized can just released from an immense crush. Elias stared at the gravity control slab, no longer touching it. The metallic taste of adrenaline was fading, replaced by the dry, chalky realization that the geometry he had manipulated, space-time itself, was still unwinding. The black hole slingshot had worked perfectly, but the universe demands balance. The permanent destabilization reported by Viridian wasn't theoretical. It was a physical, auditory reality. He pushed himself up, his knees protesting. He needed to begin the dampening sequence immediately, the localized field stabilizers to prevent the micro rifts from bleeding energy and eventually collapsing nearby orbital paths. Viridian, initiate Phase 1 stabilization protocol. Run the initial dampening calculations against the current residual tidal stresses, Elias ordered, already moving toward the auxiliary engineering console housed in the aft section of the cabin. Initiating, the AI confirmed. The console flickered to life, bathing the small space in stark green light. Elias rubbed his face, the grit of exhaustion catching on his palms. He watched the projection model spin. The residual gravity wave, the ghost of the weapon he'd fired, was behaving erratically. It wasn't diffusing smoothly. It was knotting itself into complex singularities, forming tiny, temporary black holes that vanished almost as soon as they were formed. Each disappearance sent a jarring, shuddering shock wave through the ship. Failure. The simulation results flashed in angry red across the screen. Predicted dampening field efficacy, 0.00%, Commander. The geometric instability is nonlinear. Standard protocols are insufficient, Viridian reported, the perfect calm of the voice an insult to the chaos unfolding in the math. Elias slammed his hand down on the casing of the engineering console. The vibration of the deck momentarily stopped, then resumed its chaotic humming. Insufficient. The word clawed at him, tearing through the thin layer of grim victory. It was the same word that had flashed when the Stygius 3 bridge reports had rolled in. Defensive capacity insufficient. He closed his eyes, gripping the console edge until his knuckles went white. He could see Jorik again, not dusted and gone, but sitting across from him in the academy dorm, arguing about the limits of Newtonian physics. Elias had always believed in absolute calculation. He had believed that given enough precision, failure was impossible. He had achieved absolute precision today, and still, the consequence was failure of a different order. He hadn't just saved humanity. He had contaminated his own home, leaving behind a ticking physics bomb that only he understood. And now, the initial calculations to fix it were proving exponentially harder than the calculations to destroy the enemy. Viridian, run a heuristic analysis. Model 3. Invert the resonance signature and calculate potential counterphase application. Elias snapped, abandoning the standard protocol entirely. He was flying blind now, using intuition guided by the immense, complex calculations he had performed over the last 3 days. Before the AI could respond, a hard thump reverberated from the main hatch. Commander Thorne, open the hatch. Priority 1 clearance from the Admiralty. A sharp female voice cut through the cabin speaker, metallic and crisp, utterly devoid of the exhaustion that clung to Elias like sweat. Elias frowned, checking the internal chronometer. Barely 15 minutes since the Cathar retreat. They hadn't even had time to fully vent the gravitic field buildup. Viridian, divert residual energy from the forward shields to reinforce the hatch seal. Delay command access. Tell them we are engaged in critical systems purging, Elias ordered, moving quickly to wipe the confidential sensor data from the control slab. They possess Admiral Celine Rix's personal code. Protocol mandates immediate access. Hatch security overridden, Viridian stated, completely bypassing Elias's command. The hydraulic hiss of the main hatch opening sounded loud and aggressive in the small space. Admiral Celine Rix stepped into the cabin. She was immaculate, Her uniform was crisp, pressed slate gray, and her short dark hair was perfectly sculpted. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, were not focused on Elias's exhausted figure or the fractured readout of the gravitic resonator. They were focused on the control slab itself. Rix was not a technical expert. She was a political predator, head of the System Defense Command, and a woman who viewed chaos not as a threat, but as an opportunity for consolidation of power. She had always dismissed Elias as a dangerously obsessive physicist, barely tolerated because of his theoretical models. Now, her entire posture shifted to possessiveness. "Commander Thorne, you delivered the impossible. Congratulations," Rix stated, her voice tight, devoid of real warmth. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't ask about his health. She simply surveyed the wreckage of his cabin. "I'm here to secure the tactical data and begin immediate replication." Elias felt a cold rush of nausea far worse than the gravitic distortion. "Replication? Admiral, the system is fundamentally unstable. I am running Phase 1 stabilization now. We are hemorrhaging energy from the gravitational anomaly," Elias countered, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. He needed her to understand the danger. Rix took 2 steps closer, forcing Elias to look up at her. "The anomaly can wait, Thorne. The Cathar retreat is temporary. They will report back to their hegemon that a primitive species wiped out their vanguard using absolute gravity. Do you know what that signal does? It paints a massive target on our backs. We need dozens of Eyes of the Void, operational and deployed, within the next solar cycle." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the control slab. "I need the full operational schema, the precise sequence, the alignment fields, the proprietary control algorithms you developed for the Slingshot effect. Transfer the data to my shielded courier chip, now." Elias felt the ghost of Jorik pushing him toward defiance, urging him to protect his discovery from political corruption. Jorik had died because humanity was weak. Elias had proven they weren't, but the price was instability. Giving Rix the weapon without the stabilizing counter-calculations was signing humanity's death warrant from the inside. This is the conflict, Elias realized. He could fix the system, or he could prevent the weapon's proliferation. He couldn't do both immediately. He took a slow breath, tasting the stale air and the residual ozone. "Admiral, the weapon is unique. The algorithms are tied to the specific composition of this microsingularity, the eye. Replication is impossible without weeks of calibration. Furthermore, the resonance matrix is currently degrading the ship's internal dampeners. If we don't run stabilization immediately, we risk a catastrophic structural integrity failure for the Cassandra." Rix didn't flinch. Her gaze remained sharp, assessing him not as a savior, but as a bottleneck. "You are lying, Commander. Viridian's external telemetry shows the Cassandra is operating at nominal safety levels. You are attempting to negotiate the terms of your compliance. I remind you, Thorne, that I authorized your experimental use of this weapon. I can also authorize your immediate detainment for insubordination." She stepped back, her voice dropping to a dangerous soft tone. "Don't be the paranoid scientist, Thorne. You saved us. Now, you will allow us to safeguard that victory. Transfer the schema for the offensive phase immediately. You can begin working on the stabilization, which I prefer to call advanced power consumption mitigation, after the schema is secured." Elias knew he was beaten. If he resisted, Rix would simply seize the ship and try to brute force the data, almost certainly destroying the intricate algorithms in the process. He had to be smarter. He had to play the tool. He forced his posture to slump, adopting the persona of the broken, exhausted genius. "Very well, Admiral. The schematics are encrypted under a unique 7-layer key. It will take me several hours to generate the transfer file, ensuring data integrity. I need undisturbed access to the main console." "Accepted," Rix agreed instantly, a faint flicker of triumph in her eyes. "But you won't be unsupervised." She turned, snapping a command at a security officer waiting just outside the hatch. "Lieutenant Commander Kestrel, you will maintain a dedicated watch on Thorne. He works, he sleeps when he falls over. You will ensure the offensive schema is the priority. Kestrel, a young officer with the hardened, emotionless look of career military, stepped into the cabin. She didn't look at Elias. She simply positioned herself by the main hatch, a silent, immovable presence. Rix gave Elias one last, cold look. Don't waste my time, Commander, and don't think you can pull any of your theoretical games on us now. The universe is watching, and we must be ready for the next move. With that, Rix departed, leaving the smell of expensive synth fabric and a residue of cold, absolute authority in the warm, ozone-scented air. Elias sat back down, placing his hands on the projection levers. He felt Kestrel's gaze boring into his back. His plan had changed from stabilization to pure subversion. He had promised Rix the schematics, but he knew exactly what he would prioritize. Viridian, initiate the 7-layer key generation protocol, Elias whispered, his eyes fixed on the green-lit console. But divert the output stream into the auxiliary buffer, not the transfer port, and cross-reference the failed Phase 1 stabilization data with all sensor logs for the last 12 hours. Processing, cross-referencing failed geometric models with residual wavefront disturbances. Viridian confirmed, its voice neutral. As the AI processed the complex data, Elias began manually inputting parameters for the supposed weapon schema. He typed for nearly 2 hours, fabricating data that looked convincing to military analysis but was mathematically useless for replication. Meanwhile, on the corner of the auxiliary display hidden beneath his elbow, Viridian's cross-reference analysis was running its course. Suddenly, a new small icon flashed on the auxiliary screen. Anomaly detected. Unfamiliar signature. Elias paused, his fingers freezing above the keys. He felt Kestrel shift slightly behind him, likely bored but alert. Viridian, describe the anomaly, Elias typed, keeping his head low, pretending to adjust a calibration curve. The AI responded instantly in text, appearing only on Elias's private display. A high-frequency chronoton burst was registered approximately 0.8 light-years from the Kuiper Gap, precisely where the Qatar Vanguard was neutralized. The signature does not match Qatar known technology. It is a highly compressed, narrow beam probe. Elias stared at the words. The Qatar were scattered and beaten. This was something else. Someone had registered the catastrophic energy ghost he had left behind, the sudden, silent erasure of a major fleet, and had sent a highly advanced, focused probe to investigate the scene. Rix had been right, though for the wrong reasons. The universe was watching. Analyze probe trajectory. Calculate point of origin. Elias typed, a tremor of real fear finally running through him. This was beyond the Cathar. This was a response from a civilization with the technological capability to instantly react to a localized space-time catastrophe light years away. Viridian's analysis took longer this time, calculating through relativistic distortions. The result finally appeared, stark and cold. Trajectory origin suggests a highly distant, previously undetected stellar cluster. Preliminary assessment. The probe's technology is designed for deep space entanglement monitoring. It was waiting. Elias leaned back, running a shaky hand through his hair. He hadn't just defeated an invading army. He had announced humanity's terrifying new capability to a far older, far more powerful audience. He was not merely stabilizing a system. He was trying to hide a smoking, gravitational gun from a galactic neighborhood that now knew exactly where they lived. He felt the deck plates hum beneath him, but the sound was no longer stress. It was anticipation. He had only been playing defense. Now, the game was changing. He looked at the two options on his screen. Fabricate replication schematics, Rix's priority, or calculate system evasion trajectory, Elias's new desperate priority. Elias looked over his shoulder at Kestrel, the lieutenant commander, a statue of duty. He realized he could not simply stall. He had to give Rix the schematics to buy the time necessary to solve the real problem, but he had to ensure the fake schematics were good enough to convince an entire admiralty, while he simultaneously worked on the counter-calculations and the growing threat of the probe. He smiled, a dry, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile of pure, concentrated necessity. "Viridian," he typed. "Initiate Project Sisyphus. We are going to build the most sophisticated, mathematically beautiful, and utterly useless weapon schematics ever conceived. And while we do that, we need to know exactly what that probe heard. Where is it going next?" The AI provided the next calculation result. Probe is not returning to its origin. It is accelerating towards the solar system's inner frontier. Estimated time to intercept: 22 standard days. The silence in the command cabin was suffocating. 22 days until whatever sent that probe arrived, and Elias was trapped, playing politics, while his entire solar system was hurtling toward a contact that was certainly not diplomatic. He gripped the slab, feeling the absolute cold once more, knowing he had to deceive his own people to save them from a threat he had inadvertently summoned. He had built a slingshot. Now he needed to calculate an escape velocity from his own terrible triumph. The 22 days were not a countdown, but a slow-motion crush. Time did not heal the trauma inflicted on the Cassandra. It magnified the residual stresses. Elias Thorne did not leave the command cabin. He lived in the sterile green light of the console, the recycled air growing heavy with the scent of old ozone and his own unwashed exhaustion. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel remained a silent, static presence by the hatch, a monument to the Admiralty's paranoia. Elias felt her gaze not as heat, but as perpetual, unnerving cold. He had fabricated the schema for Project Sisyphus, the useless weapon, in 3 days of punishing focus, inputting complex, convincing data that would take the Admiralty months to reverse engineer and years to realize was fundamentally flawed. It was, as he promised Viridian, mathematically beautiful in its deception. But the political game offered zero relief for the physics problem. Attempt 1, recalibrating stabilization. Elias pushed the fabricated schematics transfer to an arbitrary, slow completion rate, ensuring Kestrel watched the progress bar tick up. Simultaneously, he dove back into the stabilization nightmare. He needed to find a non-linear, counter-phase pulse to diffuse the knotting gravity waves. His first calculations had failed because they treated the phenomenon as a singular event. Viridian, run a fractal analysis on the residual tidal distortions. Isolate the micro-rift feedback loops and model a pulsed dampening field based on the harmonic inverse. Elias typed onto his hidden auxiliary display, his fingers cramping against the cold keys. The AI processed the request for 4 hours. The only sound, the faint, rhythmic whir of the cooling fans struggling against the sustained heat load. The fractal analysis returned a solution set. Elias initiated the simulation on a low-power internal cycle. The solution failed immediately, not with an error code, but a physical shudder. The deck plates beneath Elias's feet momentarily shifted, a hard, vertical lurch that knocked a tool off the nearby workbench. The synthetic gravity field of the Igi Cassandra had hiccuped, a brief taste of the uncontrolled tidal stress he was trying to prevent. Kestrel moved, not toward him, but toward the hatch controls. "Commander Thorne, report the last transient event." Her voice was tight, militaristic, and now infused with direct suspicion. Elias gripped the edge of the slab. He had failed to calculate the secondary energy input required by the inverse pulse. The attempt to stabilize had destabilized. Worse, the event revealed his continuous attempts at fixing the gravitational aftermath, contradicting his insistence to Rix that the anomaly was a low-priority power consumption issue. A momentary micro-rift resonance bleed, Lieutenant Commander, Elias stated, injecting professional weariness into his voice. A necessary side effect of the core system regeneration protocols. Nothing requiring action. Kestrel did not look away. She pressed a button on her command pad. The Admiral is diverting auxiliary power from the life support systems to the primary transfer port. She requests immediate data delivery. You have 24 standard hours to complete the transfer, or external assistance will be deployed to secure the schematics. Antagonist gains ground. The Admiralty was applying lethal pressure. They prioritized the weapon over the crew's safety. Elias realized the cost of his first failure. He had lost his political breathing room. He had to deliver the fake weapon schematics, or be exposed. Attempt 2, the moving target. Trapped. Elias went back to the raw math. He couldn't trust the computer simulations anymore. The complexity was too great. He began calculating the stabilization sequence by hand, using the auxiliary display only as a notepad. Days blurred into a single, painful continuum of zeros and ones. His vision was permanently blurred at the edges, and the metallic taste of incipient radiation sickness, a symptom of the localized rifts on the hull, was constant. He reached the core of the problem. The black hole Slingshot had not returned to its previous orbit. The eye of the void was drifting slightly, its geometric signature shifting. The stabilization calculations were failing because they were based on a fixed singularity. The actual weapon was now a moving target, a 6-dimensional polynomial required to track the drift. Impossible. Elias paused, staring at the incomprehensible equations scrolling across his private screen. He could feel Jorik's ghost nearby, demanding impossible precision. Viridian, cross-reference the current eye of the void drift signature with the energy requirements of the Slingshot firing sequence. Calculate the precise moment of maximum stress exposure. Elias typed, seeking a shortcut. If he knew when the eye had been most stressed, he could predict its current drift vector. The AI delivered the answer in seconds. Maximum stress exposure occurred at 0.004 seconds post-pulse initiation. Calculation complete. However, the data reveals an additional variable. The eye of the void's geometric signature was already oscillating prior to firing. Elias felt a cold spike of clarity. The eye hadn't just been stable, it had been actively vibrating. A fundamental, natural instability he hadn't accounted for. This instability had been magnified by the Slingshot. His attempts at stabilization were akin to patching a dam that was already cracked at the foundation. He had solved the external threat, but the internal threat, the weapon itself, was fundamentally broken, and it was his fault. He slammed his hand onto the console, not in rage, but in utter self-disgust. De mal en pire, from bad to worse. That was his curse. His precision was useless when the universe itself cheated. As he tried to regain his focus, the probe data flashed again. The anomaly-detected icon was now pulsing rapidly, accompanied by a new subroutine alert. Element introduced, the sensor network. Elias brought up the probe trajectory. In the last 24 hours, the Chronoton probe had changed its vector dramatically. It was no longer aimed generally at the inner system. It was aimed with chilling, pinpoint accuracy at the heart of the system's defense grid, the massive, deep space gravitational mapping array known as the Sentinel. Viridian, analyze why the probe would target the Sentinel. Elias typed, his fingers flying. Hypothesis: the Sentinel array possesses the most detailed gravitational field records of the solar system. If the probe's creators seek to understand the nature of the gravitational weapon used, They require the pre-event gravitational baseline to compare with the post-event distortion field. The AI responded. Elias's breath hitched. They weren't just investigating. They were performing a forensic examination of the battlefield. If they accessed the Sentinel's logs, they would see the exact moment the Cathar vanished, and they would definitively trace the physics back to humanity. The Sentinel was managed by Admiral Rix's command structure. She had access to the only data set the alien force needed. A realization hit Elias with the force of 6 million Gs. The Sentinel's data was not stored locally. It was constantly streamed to Rix's primary command center on the orbiting platform, High Command Omega Su. He needed to get that data first. He needed to alter the baseline, to contaminate the forensic evidence before the probe or Rix could use it. He looked at the two pressing problems: deliver the fake schematics in the next 6 hours, or lose the Sentinel data in the next 12. Delaying the delivery would mean Kestrel calling in a team, immediate exposure, and the certain erasure of all his work. The impossible choice. Elias looked up, meeting Kestrel's gaze across the small cabin for a split second. He was a scientist, a physicist, whose purpose was to reveal truth. Now, to save billions, he had to become the master of universal deception. He could prioritize the schematics transfer, preserving his cover. Cost. The Sentinel data is captured by Rix and potentially by the probe's owners, accelerating the external threat exponentially. He could prioritize the Sentinel hack, risking immediate capture by Rix. Cost. He loses 22 days of preparation time against the unknown enemy. Elias closed his eyes, tasting the bitterness of compromise. He had judged Rix a political predator, but he was becoming something darker, a necessary betrayer. He opened his eyes and began typing, not on the schematics display, but back on the counter-stabilization module. Viridian, initiate the final transfer of Project Sisyphus immediately. Use the 7-layer key, but simultaneously divert 50% of the power budgeted for Phase 2 stabilization into a focused, highly energetic chronoton pulse aimed at High Command Omega's primary receiving node. Use the pulse to generate a localized, temporary quantum entanglement with the Sentinel data stream. He was giving Rix the fake weapon and using the moment of distraction, the high energy transfer, to hack her primary data hub. It was an insult to mathematics, a risk of immediate collapse, and the only path forward. Viridian, for the first time, delayed for nearly 3 seconds. Commander, the power diversion will cause an immediate drop in internal atmospheric regulation and a corresponding 30% spike in localized gamma radiation. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel will register the energy surge immediately. Do it, Elias ordered, his voice thin, driven by pure necessity. He was using the physics of his triumph to commit high treason. The cabin lights dimmed violently, momentarily plunging the cabin into near darkness. A low, sizzling sound emanated from the primary conduits near the hatch. The air instantly cooled, and the high-pitched hum of residual radiation increased to an insistent whine. Kestrel reacted instantly. She pulled the sidearm from her holster, pointing the black barrel directly at Elias. "Commander Thorne, what in the void was that?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the rising noise. Elias ignored the weapon, focusing only on the auxiliary display. Entanglement, field established, data stream intercepted. He had minutes before the surge triggered automated lockdown protocols. He began working on the Sentinel data, calculating the precise mathematical noise, the contamination he needed to insert into the pre-event gravitational baseline. Kestrel's weapon remained steady, pointed at his head. The gamma whine was deafening now, causing a dizzying nausea. "I am performing a necessary systems override, Lieutenant Commander," Elias whispered, his breath catching. "If you shoot me now, You condemn the system. He injected the corrupted data into Rix's central server, a final, precise mathematical betrayal. The contamination was subtle, but effective. It wouldn't stop the probe from finding the distortion, but it would hide the point of origin, creating a fog in the forensic analysis. Data stream secured, contamination complete, Viridian reported, and the lights snapped back to full power. Kestrel didn't lower her weapon. Elias leaned back, utterly spent. He looked at the main screen. Project Sisyphus transfer, 100% complete. He had bought time. He had deceived Rix. He had contaminated the Sentinel data. He felt the cold barrel of Kestrel's sidearm press against the back of his neck, a sudden, sharp contact. The scent of burnt metal and gamma radiation filled the space. "You transferred the weapon schematics," Kestrel stated, her voice dangerously low. "But you just performed a localized quantum hack against High Command Omega during the transfer, risking structural failure. You committed high treason, Thorn." Elias waited for the inevitable click of the safety being removed. Instead, Kestrel spoke again, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the fabricated schematics on the main screen. "I know what Project Sisyphus is, Commander. It's a beautifully useless lie. You just gave the Admiralty a paperweight wrapped in a 7-layer encryption. You're not trying to save humanity from the outside. You're trying to save it from the inside." She paused, the gun barrel still cold on his skin. 22 days, Thorn. If the probe arrives and Rix realizes she has worthless data, she will execute you, and then she will give the real schematics to whoever pays the highest price for the universe's biggest slingshot. You are exposed, you are trapped, and you have no working stabilization protocol. Elias didn't need to ask how she knew. Kestrel was an officer of the fleet, but she had been staring at Elias's desperation for days. She hadn't seen a traitor. She had seen a physicist forced to be a spy. The gun remained on his neck. "I report directly to Admiral Rix, Commander, but I am also an officer of the fleet. I know the value of the Sentinel data, and I know the danger of the Chronoton probe. Tell me, Elias Thorn, after all this, what is your next calculation? Because whatever it is, I am your only variable that Rix doesn't control. And I am about to decide whether to blow your brains out or follow you into this disaster." The cold steel of Kestrel's sidearm pressed hard against Elias's neck, a perfect geometric anchor in the storm of his failure. The scent of ozone and gamma decay was thick. He felt the tremor running through her arm, not of fear, but of absolute conviction. This was the moment of reckoning, not for the Cathar, but for Elias Thorn. He didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on the console where Project Sisyphus sat, a monument to his carefully crafted deception. "You're right, Lieutenant Commander," Elias whispered, the words rasping in his dry throat. "I am exposed. I have secured the Sentinel data, but I have no stabilization protocol because the original weapon, the Eye, is unstable. I calculated for the Cathar. I failed to calculate for the Admiralty. The arrogance was mine." Kestrel didn't ease the pressure. "Arrogance is a luxury, Commander. I want the truth. Why are you risking high treason to hand Rix a dead program?" Elias sighed, a sound heavy with 60 hours of lost sleep. "Because if I give her the real data, she replicates the weapon without understanding the maintenance cost, accelerating the destabilization 1,000-fold. She would deploy the weapon across the entire sector. I needed to slow her down, to buy time to find the counterphase pulse. The only way to save billions was to lie to the one person in charge." Kestrel made a small contemptuous sound. "You're still lying, Commander. That's the surface layer of your justification. The true calculation is simpler, isn't it?" She pressed the muzzle slightly, forcing his head down. "I was on the Ethelred research team. We were the last vessel to attempt recalibration near the Eye 6 years ago. Rix shut us down. She had decided the black hole was too volatile for power generation. But I saw the logs, Thorn. I saw the telemetry from Stygius 3 the day it failed." Elias felt the cabin's artificial gravity falter for a dizzying instant, mirroring the sudden, sickening compression in his chest. "Jorik," Elias managed to choke out. "The failure of Stygius 3 wasn't accidental, Commander." Kestrel continued, her voice gaining a cold, damning intensity. "It was engineered. The gravitic shields failed, not due to a programming error, but due to a subtle, localized sabotage of the phase shift array, a highly technical flaw that only a handful of people in the fleet could execute. Rix needed the experimental black hole project cancelled. She needed a high-profile failure to justify shifting resources to her defense fleet. Jorik and those 300 lives were collateral damage in a political realignment." The metallic taste in Elias's mouth wasn't radiation sickness. It was bile. He looked at the main display, seeing the digital ghosts of the Cathar fleet, remembering the dust of Stygius 3. He hadn't been defeated by physics. He had been defeated by politics before the battle even began. His entire motivation, the grim necessity that drove him to use the Eye of the Void, was rooted in a trauma that Rix herself had manufactured. She created the desperate genius she needed, Elias whispered, the self-hatred sharp enough to draw blood. He had believed he was acting out of necessity, a lone hand saving civilization. He was merely Rix's final, perfect variable. He had been so focused on proving the slingshot could work, he hadn't seen he was performing a calculation designed to absolve Rix of prior murder. Kestrel's hand finally lowered, but the weapon remained pointed at the floor, ready. Rix didn't want the eye stabilized. She wanted it weaponized. She needed you to destroy the enemy vanguard using the most unstable possible platform. The more volatile the victory, the more justified her iron-fisted command over the subsequent massive defense budget allocation. Elias lifted his head, feeling the absence of the cold metal on his skin as a kind of phantom weight. "So, if I expose her, the fleet fragments. The political structure collapses, and the Chronoton probe arrives in 20 days to find a civilization tearing itself apart." "Exactly," Kestrel confirmed, the pragmatism chilling. "If we expose Rix now, we achieve justice, but we achieve it for a dead system. She may be a murderer, but her command structure is currently the only thing holding the defense grid together. You have to use her until you can replace her." Elias was staring at the impossible moral ledger. Justice for Jorik and the 300, resulting in the annihilation of billions, versus complicity with a political murderer, resulting in temporary, fragile survival. He ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. He had always chosen the path of least resistance in physics, the path of maximal efficiency. Now, the path of maximal efficiency led through the core of his own moral degradation. "I need to know the eye's current drift vector with absolute certainty," Elias stated, ignoring the moral equation entirely, focusing only on the numbers. "My calculations failed because the eye is oscillating. I need a real-time gravitometric sweep, but the Cassandra's internal sensors are fouled by the resonance ghost." Kestrel nodded, understanding the technical block immediately. "We can't transmit a clean signal through the anomaly we created." "No, but we can receive one," Elias countered, his mind finally clearing, slipping back into the cold logic that protected him. "I need you, Lieutenant Commander. I need you to go to the secondary antenna array, manually override the dampeners, and angle the array precisely 18.6 degrees off the axis of the slingshot's path. That position is mathematically unique. It should allow the secondary array to briefly intercept the clean, residual gravitometric data stream from the Kuiper gap." Kestrel's eyes narrowed. "That array is heavily exposed to the gamma bleed. You're asking for acute radiation exposure, Thorn." "I'm asking for the only piece of data that will tell us how to stabilize the eye before the probe arrives," Elias corrected, his voice flat. He was offering her immediate physical suffering in exchange for a single number. You're the only variable Rix doesn't control. You can't be near me when I run the final calculation, or Rix's system will flag us both. Kestrel looked from the console, the fabricated schematic still glowing faintly, to the secondary array indicators, and finally back to Elias. She saw the exhaustion, the self-loathing, and the terrifying absolute precision in his eyes. He wasn't asking for help. He was offering a necessary sacrifice. "If I do this, Commander, you owe me 2 things," Kestrel said, holding his gaze. "First, when the moment comes to end Rix's command, I pull the trigger. Second, you tell me what you plan to do after the stabilization, because I don't believe for a second you plan to just hand over the functional weapon to the Admiralty." Elias reached out, placing his hand over the control slab, feeling the familiar, cold, smooth surface. He was not making a pact. He was accepting a condition of surrender to necessity. "I won't hand over the weapon, Lieutenant Commander. I will dismantle it, and I will deal with Rix later," Elias promised, his voice low, a vow made over the wreckage of his own conscience. "Now, 18.6 degrees. Move." Kestrel didn't reply verbally. She simply holstered her weapon, gave him a curt, military nod, and headed for the hatch. The physical sound of the heavy mechanism sealing behind her was an irreversible finality. Elias immediately dove back into the console. He diverted every remaining stabilization resource to shield Kestrel's path to the secondary antenna, a desperate attempt to minimize the radiation burn he had just ordered. He watched the internal monitors, Kestrel moving quickly, efficiently, accepting the burden of physical risk while he remained trapped in the mental prison of the cockpit. Antenna array lock established. Viridian, initiate the gravitometric intake sequence the instant Lieutenant Commander Kestrel completes the alignment, Elias ordered, his fingers dancing across the keys, inputting the 6-dimensional polynomial required to process the data spike. The console hummed, anticipating the signal. Elias looked at the countdown for the chronoton probe. 19 days, 0 hours. A few agonizing minutes later, a sharp chime signaled Kestrel's success. The secondary antenna was live, bathing the cabin in a sudden, fierce spike of high-frequency static. Then, the clean data stream hit the processors. Elias stared at the numbers that appeared on the display, his previous attempts at stabilizing the eye, his personal trauma, now laid bare by absolute physics. He finally had the correct drift vector, but the data revealed something else, something hidden within the residual noise of the gravitometric stream. The chronoton probe was not a standard surveillance vessel, and its trajectory was wrong. Elias had assumed it was moving under standard propulsion, following the laws of his known physics. But the gravitational disturbances he had created had fundamentally changed the local warp field dynamics, opening up a shortcut. The entity that sent the probe wasn't just investigating, it was exploiting the mess Elias had made. The display flashed, overriding all other schematics. Chronoton platform detected as Class 3 gravimetric distortion weapon. Velocity update accelerated by residual slingshot field. The countdown clock dissolved, replaced by a terrible new calculation. ETA 0.30 standard hours. Not 19 days, 18 minutes. Elias felt the cold dread that swallowed all his carefully constructed plans, all his political maneuvering, all his moral calculus. He had bought time by committing treason against Rix, only to discover he had been operating on a timeline 19 days too slow. He hadn't just exposed humanity to a new threat. He had essentially calculated the trajectory for the enemy's primary weapon, accelerating its arrival with his own triumph. He slammed his hands against the slab, the metal screaming under the impact. He had made a critical, fatal error of assumption. The enemy wasn't adapting to his weapon. The enemy was riding the shock wave of his first shot. Viridian, Elias yelled into the empty cabin, the artificial voice the only witness to his absolute, crushing failure. What is the status of the secondary antenna? Lieutenant Commander Kestrel is exposed, Commander. She is currently 18 minutes from returning to the safety of the main hull. She is now standing directly in the path of the incoming chronoton weapon. Her position is designated Target 1. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The cost of his fatal error was measured not in seconds, but in the immediate degradation of Kestrel's biometrics. Elias watched the life support display, the line representing Lieutenant Commander Kestrel's exposure levels rising sharply, a terrifying, near-vertical climb that mirrored the acceleration of the incoming chronoton weapon. Viridian, divert all remaining auxiliary power to the secondary antenna housing shield projectors. Prioritize Kestrel's location. Now, Elias commanded, his voice strained by the sudden, brutal compression of the timeline. Executing command, Commander. Warning. Power diversion compromises 78% of internal atmospheric regulation systems. Crew survival probability degrades by 9.2% per minute. Stabilization capacity reduced to 0, Viridian replied, its voice perfectly calm, listing the immediate, suicidal concessions of Elias's choice. Elias ignored the metrics. He had secured humanity from the outside threat, only to dam it with instability. Now, he had bought humanity political time by betraying Rix, only to discover his ally was doomed by cosmic physics. If he couldn't save billions, he would at least try to save the one person who had risked everything based on his flawed integrity. He watched Kestrel's signature on the secondary monitor, a faint orange dot now, rapidly fading to red. The gamma bleed was overwhelming the localized shielding he had installed earlier. The numbers were absolute. He was condemning her to acute radiation sickness and death within minutes, all because he assumed the enemy was constrained by Newtonian propulsion. Report Kestrel's movement, Elias demanded. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel is attempting to return to the main airlock. Velocity, 1.7 meters per second. Estimated time to safe zone, 11.2 minutes. Current radiation exposure, 428 grays. Fatal threshold exceeded, Viridian reported. Elias buried his face in his hands, gripping his skull until the pressure was painful. 428 grays. It was a statistical certainty. He had given Kestrel the perfect coordinates for a data sweep, and in return, he had aimed a weapon at her head and stripped her protection. He was not a savior. He was an accelerant of doom. He was interrupted by a jarring, physical shockwave, not from the chronoton weapon, but from the main hatch. Hatch integrity breached, forced entry protocol initiated, Viridian announced. Elias looked up just as the heavy hydraulic door of the Cassandra's command cabin flew inward with a sickening crunch. 2 fleet security officers, clad in thick armor and carrying restraint coils, stepped over the wreckage. Between them walked Commander Halstead, Rix's chief political enforcer, a man whose face was perpetually set in an expression of offended bureaucracy. Elias Thorne, you are relieved of duty and placed under arrest for high treason, Halstead declared, his voice booming in the cramped, ozone-laced space. He ignored the flickering power and the whine of the compromised life support. He focused solely on the political offense. Elias didn't resist. He was too spent, too numb. He allowed the security officers to pull him away from the control slab, their touch rough and impersonal. They secured his wrists in cold, magnet-locking cuffs. Halstead ignored the desperate man and walked straight to the main console, tapping the display where Project Sisyphus still showed transfer complete. The Admiralty accepts delivery of Project Sisyphus, Commander. The replication protocols are already being prepared across 3 defense platforms, Halstead announced, a satisfied smirk cracking his thin lips. Your attempt to hijack the Sentinel data during the transfer was detected and nullified. A childish attempt, Thorn. Did you really think you could deceive Rix's primary network? Elias looked past the commander, his gaze fixed on the flashing red warning that showed the Chronoton weapon's ETA, 0.20 hours. 12 minutes. The weapon is coming, Halstead, Elias rasped, his voice raw. That probe is a gravimetric war platform, accelerated by the residual slingshot field. 12 minutes, and it hits the defense grid. Halstead laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. More paranoia from the obsessive physicist. We detected a standard chronoton signature. Our analysis places its arrival in 19 days, exactly as predicted. We have the time we need to secure your weapon and prepare our defenses. Your panicked power surges confirm only one thing, Thorn. You are fundamentally unstable and unfit for command. He turned to the security officers. Take him. Transfer him to Holding on High Command Omega. He will await trial for insubordination and the attempted sabotage of our strategic intelligence. Elias felt the crushing weight of his ultimate failure. He had sacrificed Kestrel, compromised the ship, and betrayed the Admiralty, all based on a calculation he knew was correct, only to be dismissed as a panicked liar. His brilliant, terrible physics were irrelevant. Only Rix's political reality mattered. As the officers hauled Elias toward the ruined hatch, he looked back at the control slab. Halstead was smiling, satisfied with his total political victory. The countdown was ticking silently beneath the false 19-day reading. Elias felt the moment of ultimate collapse. He saw Jorik's face, not in anger, but in resignation. He saw Kestrel's fading orange dot. He saw Rix's engineered betrayal. Why do I fight? The thought was heavy, suffocating. They are right. I am an accelerant. I create chaos. I couldn't save Jorik. I couldn't save Kestrel. I can't even save my own mind from the guilt. Was it all just arrogance, disguised as principle? Was I always meant to fail because I dared to think I could outcalculate fate? Elias felt the desperate, cold truth settle. He was not a hero attempting to save the world. He was a coward, running from the responsibility of having failed once, and in doing so, he had doomed far more. It was time to stop. Time to accept the defeat. The security team dragged him past the broken hatch. Just as they crossed the threshold into the main corridor, Elias heard Viridian's voice, not through the cabin speakers, but directly into the cuff's embedded comlink, a highly illegal, dedicated frequency Elias had programmed months ago for emergency, low-power transmissions. Commander Thorn, a new data stream is being received from the secondary antenna array, Viridian whispered, the modulation barely audible over the corridor noise. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel has ceased movement. Her biometrics have flatlined. However, her unique exposure position to the Chronoton weapon, coupled with the gamma bleed, has generated a localized effect. Elias struggled against the guards, but they held him fast. What effect? He demanded internally, focusing his mind fiercely on the transmission. The Chronoton weapon, in its accelerated state, is attempting to utilize Kestrel's irradiated, exposed body as a localized gravimetric anchor point. It has miscalculated. The interaction creates a temporal dilation field, localized only to her immediate vicinity. She is trapped in a micro-pocket of space-time, moments from death, but not fully dead, Viridian explained. Elias stared at the floor, seeing the impossible physics. Kestrel was an accidental living singularity. The effect is temporary, predicted duration, 28 seconds. However, this creates an unprecedented geometric opportunity. If you can inject a focused, maximum power pulse into the Cassandra's primary gravitic resonator, the damaged core, it will utilize Kestrel's temporal pocket as a relay point. The resulting explosion will generate a hyper-localized inverse resonance field. It will not destroy the Chronoton weapon, Commander. but it will deflect its trajectory. The core is fractured, Elias stated, tasting the metallic fear and hope simultaneously. Overloading the resonator means core breach, total annihilation of the Cassandra and everything within 300 meters. Calculation confirmed, guaranteed total system collapse, death probability 99.999%. Viridian confirmed, clinically stating his execution, but the resulting inverse field will push the chronoton weapon off its current vector, diverting it away from the populated inner system. Halstead barked an order to the guards to move faster. Elias had seconds before he was out of range. He was shackled, defeated, and exposed. His ship was compromised, and his only ally was caught in a lethal time pocket. He had nothing left to use but his own life. Elias focused his will, pushing against the restraints. He used the brief surge of adrenaline to temporarily overcome the lingering neural inhibitor. It lasted 3 seconds. Enough. He slammed his head back, hard, into the face of the nearest guard. The guard grunted and released his grip momentarily. Elias dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain. Viridian, primary override now. Unlock the magnetic restraints on the console slab. Elias roared, knowing the guards were already recovering. Halstead spun around, drawing his energy pistol. Thorn, stop! Elias ignored the weapon, scrambling back towards the ruined command cabin. He reached the slab, his hands trembling. He couldn't input the complex code fast enough. Viridian, self-destruct sequence. Code, Jorix dust, Elias commanded, using the deeply embedded sequence only he and the AI knew. A sharp, piercing klaxon blared through the cabin and the corridor, a real alarm this time, overriding all systems. Halstead froze, his pistol half raised. The self-destruct sequence had begun. Sequence accepted. Core overload initiated. 25-second countdown. Viridian announced, the voice of doom ringing clear. Elias placed his cuffed hands on the cold, beautiful slab, running the final, terrible calculation one last time in his mind. He had failed to save them with math. He would save them with sacrifice. Halstead screamed, turning to flee the doomed ship. The remaining security guard raised his pistol, aiming for Elias's head, but the commander's focus was on the countdown. Viridian, transfer the remaining 73% charge into the resonator now. Bypass all safety interlocks. Elias yelled, overriding the self-destruct's gradual decay with an immediate, violent surge. The deck plates vibrated violently. A high-pitched, crystalline shriek filled the cabin, the sound of the fractured gravitic resonator absorbing too much power. Elias braced himself, ready for the blast that would wipe out the Cassandra, and finally silence his own guilt. But the shriek was followed by a sharp pop, and the air suddenly tasted of electrical burning. The main display flickered, displaying one final, horrifying metric. Resonator failed. Core injection impossible. The structural integrity of the resonator was too compromised by the slingshot. It failed before achieving critical mass. Inversion pulse impossible, Viridian reported, the voice expressing utter finality. Chronoton weapon ETA, 9 seconds. Commander Thorn, you have failed. Elias stared at the slab, the metal cooling rapidly beneath his hands. He had risked everything, guaranteed his death, and still failed to achieve the necessary physics. He had nothing left. Absolutely nothing. The deck lurched violently as the chronoton weapon entered the system. Halstead was screaming, scrabbling for the door. Elias looked at the display showing Kestrel's position, still locked in her tiny, temporary time pocket, a perfect, impossible geometric target. The field was collapsing. She had perhaps 3 seconds left before the wave hit her, and in that final instant of absolute despair, Elias saw it. Not a calculation, but an anthropological necessity. He saw the only remaining piece of viable material that could serve as a gravitational focusing lens in the immediate vicinity. It wasn't a piece of the ship, it was the micro-singularity, the eye of the void, still anchored at the Kuiper Gap. The eye was too far away to hit directly, But Kestrel's collapsing temporal field, her imminent, specific death, was now perfectly aligned to serve as the launch platform for one last, impossible slingshot. A slingshot that would use the last burst of energy from the failed core, fired through Kestrel's localized space-time collapse, aimed not at the weapon, but at the eye itself, hoping to create a secondary, wild distortion wave. He didn't have time to calculate the full trajectory. He had only enough time to run the raw, primal impulse. He took one final, shuddering breath. He had to fire the entire remaining power, the last vestige of the Cassandra's life, at the eye, using Kestrel as the catastrophic focal point. Viridian, all remaining power, transfer to the propulsion coils. Vector set to target Kestrel's collapsing field. Maximum velocity. Eject the primary core housing. Now, Elias slammed the primary propulsion lever forward, overriding the safety. The ship did not explode. It bucked with a violent, impossible thrust as the remaining fuel was ignited in a desperate, final propulsion burst, driving the Cassandra, not toward the enemy, but toward the heart of the anomaly he had created. He was turning his ship into a single, high-speed projectile, aimed at the black hole, using the living sacrifice of his only ally as the launch conduit. The self-destruct sequence, code, Jorik's dust, was only a memory now, a final, beautiful piece of math that failed the test of reality. The gravitic resonator was dead. The chronoton weapon was 9 seconds from hitting Kestrel. Elias was cuffed, pinned by the remaining security officer, who was now grappling with Halstead in a blind panic near the ruined hatch. Elias ignored the screaming men. He ignored the pain in his head from the head slam. He focused only on the cold, smooth metal of the primary propulsion lever beneath his shackled hands. He was steering a ship that was already destroyed, aimed at the ultimate weapon he had created, the black hole. Viridian, confirmation on vector alignment. Elias gasped, his lungs burning from the thin, ozone-laced air. Vector confirmation, successful. Targeting Kestrel's temporary geometric anomaly, Viridian reported, the perfect calm of the voice contrasting violently with the chaos. Elias slammed the primary propulsion lever forward. The surge was not a slow build. It was an instantaneous, brutal act of mechanical suicide. The remaining fuel, 73% of which had been intended for the stabilization protocol, ignited in a single, desperate, unshielded burst. The Cassandra did not explode outward. It bucked with a tearing sound, driving inward with a force that crushed Halstead against the hatch frame like paper. The surviving security officer, momentarily distracted by Halstead's grisly end, tried to raise his energy pistol. Elias didn't wait for the shot. He used the extreme acceleration of the ship, the only thing he still commanded, as his defense. The magnetic restraints on his wrists dug violently into the control slab as he braced himself. He felt the blood pooling beneath the cuffs, but the sheer inertia saved him. The guard was thrown backward, hitting the bulkhead with a sickening thud, his pistol skittering uselessly across the deck plates. Elias had a moment of terrible, absolute clarity. This was the true slingshot. Not the controlled, theoretical physics he had planned for the Cathar, but a raw, kinetic, desperate act of destruction. He wasn't manipulating gravity. He was riding chaos. He held the propulsion lever locked, feeling the ship's structure tearing itself apart around him. The metallic shriek of stressed metal joined the continuous, deafening alarm. Warning lights flashed in angry red and yellow across the fractured display. He was flying blind. His eyes were watering from the acceleration forces and the gamma radiation spiking violently as the residual shielding failed. He had to fire the final component, the ejected core housing, through Kestrel's precise, lethal coordinate before the temporal pocket collapsed. 3 seconds. Viridian, report on temporal dilation stability. Elias managed to choke out, the force pressing him deep into his seat. Stability degrading. Estimated collapse 1.5 seconds. The AI replied. Elias needed less than that. He reached for the core ejection switch, a manual override positioned far too close to the main power conduits. He had to yank the lever with his already cuffed, bloodied hands. He pulled. The impact was not external, but internal. The primary core housing, a sphere of high-density fusion plasma meant to power the ship for years, was ejected violently from its mounting, driven by pure kinetic force rather than controlled magnetic containment. The sphere shot through the airlock, down the corridor, and out into the void, accelerating toward the secondary antenna array. Elias felt the immense, sickening vibration as the core housing passed within centimeters of Kestrel's position. He looked at the external monitor. A burst of impossible light. Not a thermal explosion, but a sudden, violent warp. Kestrel's temporal pocket, moments before collapsing, had acted as a focused lens. The core housing, accelerated by the Cassandra's suicidal burst and refracted by Kestrel's geometry, was launched at relativistic velocity toward the distant, anchoring black hole, the eye of the void. 0 seconds. For a moment, there was a terrible silence, not the peace of completion, but the emptiness after a catastrophic surge. Elias released the propulsion lever. The Cassandra was now a crippled ghost, hurtling out of control. On the main display, the metric for the chronoton weapon flickered wildly. It had been moments from impact. Now, the projected path showed a sudden, violent destabilization. The core housing had struck the eye's distortion field, generating a secondary, uncontrolled gravitational pulse, a cosmic rogue wave that slammed into the chronoton platform. The weapon did not explode. It simply bent. Its highly refined geometry was violently disrupted by the chaotic wave. Its vector shifted dramatically, pulled hard by the new, uncontrolled distortion field of the eye. The chronoton weapon was deflected, violently accelerating away from the inner solar system, thrown deep into the void toward the Kuiper Gap. Elias slumped back, every muscle screaming in protest. He had done it. He hadn't defeated the weapon. He had simply insulted its geometry so profoundly that it was forced to retreat. The silence returned, broken only by the crackling of ruptured conduits and the low, agonizing hum of failing life support. He looked over at the hatch. Halstead's body was unrecognizable, a victim of simple inertia and physics. The security officer was groaning, likely suffering severe internal injuries. Elias had used 2 human lives and his entire ship's infrastructure to achieve a temporary diversion. Viridian, report Kestrel's status. Now, Elias ordered, his voice thin, laced with adrenaline and guilt. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel's biometric signature is offline. The secondary antenna array suffered catastrophic failure due to the gravitational shock wave. The data is inconclusive, the AI stated. However, the core housing trajectory confirms that the temporal dilation field was successfully utilized for the final refraction. Kestrel was gone, whether by the gamma radiation, the temporal collapse, or the chaotic shock wave. Her existence had been erased, but not before her sacrifice was used as the final geometric component in his impossible equation. Elias lifted his hands, still clasped by the magnetic cuffs, and laid them gently on the control slab. The metal was cooling, silent. He had won. Humanity was temporarily safe. He finally addressed the remaining conflict, the man groaning weakly on the deck. "Commander Halstead," Elias rasped, lifting his voice slightly. "Admiral Rix's weapon schematics, Project Sisyphus, are now irrelevant. The Eye of the Void is now a freely drifting, highly unstable singularity. The universe is watching a species that used a black hole to deflect a weapon. We have no defense, no stabilization, and no political structure left." Halstead did not look up, but his voice, though muffled by pain, was chillingly coherent. You acted without authorization, Thorn. You destroyed 2 billion credits of Admiralty property. You committed regicide against our command structure. You will be held accountable for every life lost, every dollar wasted. You are a genius, Thorn, but you are also a catastrophic failure of discipline. Rix was right to fear the volatility of your kind. Halstead paused, coughing wetly. You saved the system by destroying the entire Cassandra asset. Your victory is politically and financially catastrophic. You understand nothing of governance. Elias felt the last shred of self-justification drain away. Halstead was right. Elias had solved the physics problem by creating an infinitely larger political and infrastructural crisis. He hadn't stopped Rix. He had merely provided her with a perfect scapegoat and a desperate new power vacuum. He looked at his cuffed, trembling hands. The residual neural inhibitors, coupled with the extreme G-force exposure, meant the tremor was now permanent. He was a physicist who could no longer handle precision instruments. Elias accepted the cold reality. He was not a hero. He was a cleaner, and a messy one at that. He did what was necessary, and necessity had cost him everything: his ship, his only ally, and his ability to practice his craft. Viridian, Elias whispered, ignoring Halstead's continued accusations. Initiate minimum power diagnostics. Assess the current structural integrity of the Cassandra. Structural integrity is at 0.009%, Commander. The ship is currently held together by residual magnetic fields and favorable atomic bonding. We are dead in space. Long-term survival probability negligible, the AI reported. Elias closed his eyes, inhaling the metallic, irradiated air. He sat in the wreck, the silence heavy with the absence of Kestrel and the weight of Halstead's damning logic. He had simply exchanged one existential crisis for another. The Cathar were gone, but the unknown civilization that sent the Chronoton weapon now knew exactly how destructive humanity could be. And humanity's only defense, the Eye, was now a runaway force, requiring calculations exponentially more complex to capture than it ever did to weaponize. The internal comm link crackled once more. Commander Thorn, external contact detected. Admiral Rix's flagship, the Intrepid, is approaching at sublight speed. They have registered the violent acceleration and the failure of the self-destruct sequence. They are sending a recovery and seizure team. Elias opened his eyes. Rix hadn't died in the explosion. The confrontation wasn't over. It had merely shifted from physics to politics, fought on a field where Elias was now crippled and cornered. He had won the battle for the system, only to be captured and executed by the people he had saved. The silence of the void was temporary. The injustice, he knew, was just beginning. He still had one move left, but he needed his hands free to make it. He sat back in the pilot's seat of the ruined ship, the magnetic cuffs cold on his wrists, and waited for the approach of the Intrepid. He had only bought minutes. Now he had to calculate how to survive the inevitable. The recovery team from the Intrepid used shaped charges to carve a clean, clinical entrance into the fractured hull of the Cassandra. They were not salvagers. They were extraction specialists. Elias was dragged from the wreck by two medics, his body protesting every acceleration, every sudden stop. He felt the blood dry and crack beneath the magnetic cuffs. The last thing he saw as they pulled him through the shattered command cabin was the primary control slab, the cold, smooth metal that had been his world for 60 hours, now covered in dust, blood, and the metallic residue of an explosion that almost was. They did not take him to a medical bay. They took him directly to a high-security interrogation pod on the Intrepid, a small windowless space painted institutional white, smelling faintly of disinfectant and ozone. He was unchained only long enough for a surgical team to clean his wounds and remove the permanent magnetic restraints. The tremor in his hands, however, remained. It was not a superficial muscular twitch, but a deep, rhythmic vibration born of neural damage from the sustained G-forces and localized gamma exposure. The surgeon, an emotionless man named Dr. Selm, confirmed it with the detached air of someone announcing a software bug. Permanent kinetic imbalance, Commander. You won't be performing high-precision work again. Your calibration days are over, Selm stated, applying a thick synthetic bandage to Elias's wrist. It's a miracle your optic nerves held up under the tidal stresses you generated. Elias didn't respond. The permanent tremor was the final, perfect injustice. He had survived the war by proving his precision was absolute. Now, he was defined by his inability to be precise. Admiral Rix appeared 20 minutes later, flanked by 4 security personnel. She was immaculate, her slate-gray uniform untouched by the trauma of the system she governed. She looked down at Elias, who was sitting on the sterile bench, his exhausted face contrasting sharply with the white walls. "Congratulations, Commander Thorne," Rix said, her voice devoid of triumph, edged only with professional annoyance. "You saved the solar system. You committed regicide against my chief enforcer. You destroyed a 2 billion credit asset and created an orbital disaster that will take decades to clean up. You are the perfect victory and the perfect disaster." Elias simply met her gaze. The chronotone weapon was deflected. Kestrel provided the focal point. Rix's jaw tightened at the mention of Kestrel. The lieutenant commander's status is listed as MIA, presumed lost in the field of debris. Her sacrifice will be noted. Yours, Commander, will be categorized. She leaned closer, her eyes glittering with cold calculation. I presented Project Sisyphus to the Council. A beautiful lie. It has bought me the political capital to stabilize the budget and militarize the sector. They believe they have the weapon. They believe I am managing the transition. But you and I know the truth, don't we, Thorne? The eye of the void is now a freely drifting, highly volatile singularity. It is a time bomb that only you can predict. Elias felt the tremor in his hands worsen, a physical manifestation of his guilt over Kestrel and his frustration at Rix's political mastery. "You won," Elias stated flatly. "You achieved maximum political power while deflecting the external threat, all thanks to the very instability you engineered at Stygius III. Rix smiled, a terrifying, quick flicker of absolute satisfaction. "I utilize chaos, Thorne. You merely react to it. That is the fundamental difference between command and calculation. Now, we move to the final necessity." She tapped a datapad. "You are convicted of high treason, gross destruction of Admiralty property, and insubordination. The penalty is execution. However, the sheer mathematical complexity of capturing and stabilizing the drifting eye of the void is beyond anyone else in the fleet. You are the only one who truly understands the equations of this chaos." "You need me to clean up my own mess," Elias finished. "Precisely. You are too dangerous to be free, and too essential to kill. Therefore, the Admiralty has approved a new classification for you. Asset 0. Rick stepped back, making a grand, dismissive gesture with her hand. "You will serve your life sentence on orbital platform Theta 7, a highly secure, non-transmitting facility established at the boundary of the Kuiper Gap. You will be monitored constantly. You will have no contact with the outside world. Your sole function will be to calculate the capture trajectory and stabilization protocols for the eye of the void, ensuring it is neutralized before it collides with any populated area or is found by a hostile entity." The injustice was complete. He had saved billions only to be imprisoned and forced to calculate the undoing of his own terrifying victory. "What about Viridian?" Elias asked, feeling the finality of loss. "The AI's core memory has been wiped and repurposed for mundane fleet logistics. All records of the Slingshot sequence are classified under Project Sisyphus and locked down." "You are the only surviving record of the truth," Rix concluded. "You are politically dead, Thorne, but you are mathematically essential. Enjoy your isolation." Rix left the pod without another word, the heavy magnetic door sealing with a sound of utter finality. Elias was transferred 2 days later. The orbital prison, Theta 7, was not a dark cell, but a marvel of sterile, ergonomic design, a single, massive room with walls of smooth, polished black basalt, specifically designed to absorb all internal energy emissions. He was given a bed, sustenance, and a terminal, a flat, opaque slab of ceramic, non-conductive and utterly disconnected from any external network. It was designed purely for complex internal calculations. They had given him the perfect tool for his mind, coupled with the perfect environment for his punishment. Elias sat on the basalt floor, his fingers tracing the cool, inert surface of the calculation slab. He looked out the single narrow viewport. Outside, the stars were cold pinpricks of light, utterly indifferent. He was near the edge of the system, close to the black hole he had unleashed. He was separated from humanity not by inches, but by light years of calculated distance. He began his work, not with the stabilization protocols Rix demanded, but with a different kind of calculation. He ran Kestrel's biometric data one last time, cross-referencing her known mass, velocity, and exposure levels with the shockwave profile. He calculated the specific geometric distortion she had endured. He wanted to know, definitively, what happened to her. He spent 4 weeks on the problem, using the ceramic slab to model the quantum mechanics of a body trapped in a collapsing temporal field near a chaotic gravitational event. The final answer was simple, chilling, and absolute. Kestrel's mass had not been annihilated. It had been dispersed. The collapsing temporal pocket had shattered her body across a momentary, non-linear dimension. Her physical form no longer existed in sequential time, but her energy signature remained, a faint, non-local echo trapped in the very geometric anomaly that had saved the system. She was, mathematically, everywhere and nowhere. Elias finished the equation, the result flashing briefly on the ceramic slab. Kestrel, S, status, permanent non-locality, contributed factor, essential. He felt no surge of grief, only a deep, permanent acceptance. She had been used perfectly by the cruel geometry he commanded. His victory had demanded her absolute sacrifice. He wiped the calculation from the slab and began the work Rix required. He started modeling the eye's current, volatile drift, a 6-dimensional polynomial that stretched the limits of his concentration. He felt the constant tremor in his hands, forcing him to input variables slowly, carefully, constantly correcting minute errors caused by the shaking. He was a broken man, sentenced to eternal calculation, but his mind remained terrifyingly sharp. He realized that this was his fate, to forever pursue the impossible precision that would stabilize the chaos he had created, knowing that the cost was paid by the dust of Jorik, the non-existence of Kestrel, and his own permanent isolation. He was the final, flawed variable of a species that had dared to play with absolute physics. He had looked into the void, and the void, having been used as a slingshot, had repaid him by taking away the only thing that defined him, his hands. He looked out at the infinite, cold field of stars, now calculating the geometry of the black hole's drift with his permanently imprecise, shaking fingers. He was no longer Elias Thorne, commander or physicist. He was the consequence, the chill of the deck plates. That terrible personal coldness he had always fought was gone now. He sat in his basalt cell, the tremor in his hands a constant private reminder that the great, indifferent void had finally claimed him, and there was nothing left to calculate. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.